project basically looks at the issue of undocumented immigration in the United States and the extent to which it reflects systems of oppression that serves as tools of exclusion of those who do not really belong to majority groups. Specifically, what we look at is the extent to which support for rigorous anti-undocumented policies, like Arizona's SB 1070, the extent to which support for such policies really reflect racist or ethnocentric considerations as opposed to neutral concerns for legality. And we look at how this racialized understanding of immigration policy is associated with different understandings of what it means to be a member of the United States and who is or isn't considered a true member of the United States. So in this particular project, we specifically focus on the provisions in Arizona SB 1070. Although the similar forms of legislation has been passed in 14 other states in the United States. This policy basically mandates that undocumented immigrants must always have immigrants must always have their immigration documents in their possession, and failure to do so can result in them being detained. And police officers have the right to really question anyone about their legal or immigrant status, and they can detain them if they don't have the documents with them. And the implementation of this bill really created a huge debate between opponents who believe that policies like this really form institutionalized forms of racism, and they discriminate against not just undocumented immigrants, but really anyone who doesn't really assimilate or belong to white majority groups. Specifically, they believe that implementation of these policies will be associated with anti-Mexican sentiments and targeting not just undocumented Mexican immigrants, but even those who are citizens. In contrast, policymakers and the author of this bill basically talks about how this is really not so much of a race and frames this issue of undocumented immigration as something that's illegal and something that's a crime, and that policies like this are more about anti-crime and nothing to do with race or ethnicity. And what we basically ask in this particular project is really whether concern for legality really operates as a smokescreen for anti-Mexican sentiments, and how is this related to our understandings of national identity. So we basically focus on two different dimensions of national identification. The first looks at how the level of identification. So one can make a distinction between nationalism and patriotism, and this is something that was covered earlier on today. But just to briefly summarize, nationalism is associated with feelings of superiority of one's nation. So my nation is better than other nations, and patriotism is really associated with a form of attachment. So myself with respect to the nation. So I'm proud of my nation. And in general, research has associated nationalism with greater intolerance towards ethnic and racial minorities, and defining nation in terms of a homogeneous group, in terms of race and ethnic groups. And patriotism has been associated with greater tolerance towards ethnic and minority groups, and associated with more multicultural constructions of the nation. However, beyond just levels of identification, we are also interested in meanings of identification. So what does it really mean when you say that you are a member of the US, and who do you consider to be a member of the US, and what do you have to do to be a true member? We basically make distinctions between three different constructions. Primordial construction is really a very exclusive form of construction where you're defining identity in terms of being born in that nation. So in the context of immigration, endorsing this would really exclude all first-generation immigrants from really being considered a member of the nation. Cultural constructions of identity, they're also another exclusive form of construction where you really define membership in terms of assimilation to dominant cultural values. And in the context of the US, it would be in terms of assimilation to values which are more Eurocentric. So an example would be knowledge of English language to really be a true member. And in the context of immigration, this can be seen as even more exclusive than primordial, because it can, possibly exclude not just first-generation immigrants, but second or third, and even and citizens basically who do not really assimilate, who don't really conform to certain values. And finally, civic constructions. They're a relatively more inclusive construction where you form these conceptual boundaries of the nation, which is very permeable. And the idea is that instead of really being born in the United States or really conforming to certain cultural Eurocentric values, how much can you really engage with your community, and how much do you have knowledge of the country in which you're residing in. And in the context of immigration, it really includes a lot of immigrants from being members of the United States or the nation. So we were basically interested in how these markers of national identification is associated with racialized support for immigration policy. We conducted 2 studies. The first one looked at the extent to which, when people express concerns about undocumented or illegal immigration, is it really about the process of immigration as such, or is there really a preference and focus only on the immigrants and not so much on everybody who contributes towards the issue of immigration? So this was a study where students from KU and also people from the Kansas City metropolitan area participated, and it was a paper and pencil study. And participants basically completed measures on nationalism and patriotism, understandings of what it means to be a member of the United States, and also they indicated their support for immigration policy. And these items were basically taken they were adapted from the Arizona SB 1070. So there were a couple of items which focused on punishing the immigrant, so for not carrying their documents with them. And there were 2 items which focused on punishing the employers. And these are also items which are located in the bill. So basically punishing the employer for knowingly employing them and for exploiting undocumented immigrants. And all these items were basically measured on a scale of 1 to 7. So 7 being you strongly agree with these statements, and 1 being strongly disagree. And what we found was that we were specifically interested in the extent to which participants were more likely to punish immigrants over punishing employers. And we label this term as ethnocentric enforcement bias, showing the extent to which it's not really so much about immigration, but you want to really punish one side of the immigration process. So nationalism was related to this ethnocentric enforcement bias and not patriotism. And further, those who defined U.S. national identity in terms of assimilation to Eurocentric values like knowing English language were more likely to indicate that the immigrants should be punished over employers who prosecute undocumented immigrants. And this suggests that if it's really about the case of legality, then one would expect everyone to punish all lawbreakers equally. But this pattern was only observed for patriotism, suggesting that this concern for undocumented immigration may have to do with nationalistic and ethnocentric considerations, and the fact that it was associated with defining U.S. identity in terms of assimilation to cultural standards shows that it could reflect that people view immigrants in some ways as a threat to their identity in terms of threat to their cultural identity and Eurocentric values. So the second study basically looked at, is it really about equally having negative attitudes towards all against all undocumented immigrants, or is it really about having viewing undocumented Mexican immigrants, or is it about just viewing Mexican immigrants negatively? Regardless of their legal status. So in other words, is it really about legal status, or even if it's a documented Mexican immigrant, would you still view that group and evaluate them negatively? So in this case, the participants were all from KU, and this was really an online study. And participants read this newspaper story about this immigrant and a police officer. The immigrant was speaking on the phone outside an ATM late at night, and a police officer basically finds this immigrant's behavior as suspicious and proceeds to question him and ask him for his identification. And since he just stepped out to take some money out of the ATM, he didn't have any, and as a result of which the immigrant was detained. And the immigrant was either, participants read this newspaper story, and the immigrant was either an undocumented Mexican immigrant, a documented Mexican immigrant, an undocumented Canadian immigrant, or a documented Canadian immigrant. And the reason why we basically contrasted the Mexican with the Canadian was to look at the extent to which the idea of ethnic group matters, racialized group matters. Those who conform to presumably Eurocentric values are more likely to make a bias and a distinction between Mexican and Canadian immigrants. So after they read that newspaper story, participants then completed a set of measures, and again, all of them are rated on a scale of 1 to 7, with 7 being strongly agree and 1 being strongly disagree. So the first one was looking at the extent to which they should, participants supported that the immigrant concerned should be punished and detained for not having his ID, and the extent to which the police officer should be sued and punished for thinking that this behavior was suspicious and for really being very harsh. And what we were interested in was the extent to which people were more likely to support that the immigrant should be punished over the officer. And this is what we label as the ethnocentric punishment bias. Then we were interested in whether participants thought that this whole form of treatment was fair. So was it fair, to expect that, this immigrant should carry his ID at all given times? Was it fair that he should be detained, and was it even fair that the situation should be considered something which arouses suspicion? And then we were also interested in something what we label as ethnocentric evaluation bias. That is the extent to which you would blame the immigrant for his irresponsibility over the police officer for being a jerk. And then finally, participants were also filled out the measures on national identity, which was the same as the previous study. So what we find is that they were more likely to punish the undocumented immigrants, but they were also more likely to punish the Mexican undocumented immigrant more than the Canadian undocumented immigrant. And when it came to perceiving this treatment as fair, in this case, legal status didn't even matter. Here, they basically thought that everything was fair, and the concept of this situation being reasonably suspicious was completely fair when the Mexican immigrant was involved. And this is even when it was a documented Mexican immigrant compared to the undocumented Canadian immigrant. And then finally, when it came to making these evaluations of the immigrant and the police officer, they evaluated the immigrant more negatively over the police officer and blamed the immigrant more when the target was undocumented, so when it was an undocumented immigrant, and more so when the immigrant involved was a Mexican immigrant. Finally, we were also interested in how this racialized understanding was associated with understandings of national identity. And similar to the first study, we found that defining U.S. identity in terms of English language was associated with a more racialized understanding of immigration policy. And interesting here in this case, it was also that defining U.S. identity in terms of birthplace, which is primordial construction, was also associated with punishing immigrant more over the police officer, especially when the immigrant was a Mexican. And this is really consistent with some of the debate that has been happening in terms of policy legislation, where there's been a movement towards having English as the national language and doing away with signs, and all official documents should be in English only and no other language. And also in terms of doing away with birthright citizenship, where undocumented children of undocumented immigrants should not be allowed to become U.S. citizens. And so the results of these two studies suggest that it's not so much about this neutral concern for law, and people don't really, to the extent you treat this as something which is illegal and as a crime, you don't really, at least in this study, the participants did not treat all lawbreakers equally. And there was a preference for focusing more and punishing Mexican immigrants more over Canadian immigrants. And this is really reflective of the fears that Mexicans have, who see themselves being discriminated more than others, and shows that their fear is really objective and legitimate and stems from particular experiences. And finally, beyond just the fact that they're discriminated against, this study also reveals the fact that there are some groups, by virtue of their race and by virtue of their ethnicity, they really are awarded greater privilege. Because in the same way, you would consider that, okay, some lawbreakers are more likely to punish. You also have US employers in the first study and Canadian immigrants who may also break the law but who are more likely to go unpunished in the context of this immigration support. So